Hi, and good afternoon, everyone, and good evening to those who might be on the Zoom. Thank you for that kind introduction. And really, the credit actually goes to my colleague, Dipali Khanna, who is the head of our Asia region and has really been spearheading this work on behalf of the foundation. So thank you and welcome to our new convening space. And I think this agenda has been incredibly important, the 2030 agenda after the G7 and G20 India summits. And it is a real privilege to be able to address and to be here with you today. I think because, as you've seen this week, everything is changing so rapidly, and it is just at the fore of our consciousness. It is this pursuit that the Rockefeller Foundation has had at its core for 110 years, the well-being of humanity. That's the reason why we continue to push and believe in the agenda and the work that you are doing here to really help us build the world that is more equitable and is more green. And that I think many of you were probably also this week at our offices for the 17 rooms convening as well, and really trying to drive action against the Sustainable Development Goals, which we all know need to make further action. Recent global events, including the G7 summit in Japan and the G20 in India, have really highlighted opportunities and challenges in the journey that we've talked about to achieve the SDGs. And so we feel as an institution that we're at this really important moment that we need to continue to drive progress, especially coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has changed the course of where we were all focused for a while. And so I think we really as an institution are focused on the climate crisis, the growing economic disparity, food insecurity, public health, social justice. Now, I think I've spent, ironically, a number of conversations actually on a discussion around migration unexpectedly as another key challenge that we continue to see. And so at the G7 Hiroshima summit, the G7 nations talked about the peak of GHGs really needing to be reached by 2025, and they committed to the acceleration agenda for G7 countries to reach net zero emissions by 2040 and urged emerging economies to do so by 2050. And there were also discussions about bridging the gap between global south and more advanced economies. And nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation were also, I think, key features at your summit. And at the G20 summit in New Delhi, the key takeaway there was India's bridging disposition, working with countries industrialized and developing to really make sure that we produced a consensus. And of equal importance was a real natural extension of India's appreciation of how the international order structurally and institutionally disregarded the plight and condition of low-income countries. And the joint agreement really focused on climate finance, debt relief, international financial reform like the World Bank and this Green Development Pact. And it was great to see that India really pushed for a growth first agenda, and just given the challenges that we see in the global economy. So the climate crisis, I think we've heard all about it this week. And I think that the need to resource it and address it was a key area of focus in the summit. And so in view of that 2030 agenda, and more so for humanity's future, I think the statistic that continue to strike me, and I thank my colleague Ashwin Dayal for reminding of this constantly, is that 75% of global emissions in 2050 could come from the 81 countries that are unelectrified. And so from our perspective as a foundation, we believe strongly that we need to empower the 3.6 billion people who currently live in energy poverty, 800 million who are completely in the dark. And we need to do that with clean energy to make sure that we don't surpass that tipping point. I think the other juxtaposition that we as a foundation are focused on is the food system, because we fail to nourish 3 billion people, even though we have 25 to 30% of global emissions. And so our focus is really driving a planet where we have food that is accessible and good for people and the planet. The other paradigm that we as a foundation are focused on is the health sector. And even though it only accounts for 4% of global emissions, the challenge that 3.3 billion people are bearing significant health impacts from climate change. We need to be in a position where we can better detect, respond to, manage disease outbreaks, and other factors that we don't even know yet are happening because of climate change. And the last piece that we as a foundation are also focused on is the 3.2 trillion of financing that is needed by communities that are deeply affected by climate change. and making sure that we build a green and equitable financial system that unlocks opportunities and get it to people that need it the most. And so thank you to this room as the world's most influential think tanks and leaders of nonprofit foundations, of other civil society. We have a really unique responsibility, we believe, to go beyond the borders of politics and really be able to drive in this room the ideas, the knowledge, the action that we need to take forward. And I think perhaps you might have seen the foundation released its climate strategy, the first time ever in 110 years that we have a unified climate strategy that encompasses those 4 pillars that we are working on as an institution. And because it's not just about the programs, it's about how we live our values, we're also working on the operations side to really think about how we can deliver a net zero footprint so that we model and we walk the talk. And so I wanted to thank you all for being here. You are the driving force of the world that we need to create. Thank you for inspiring us. Thank you for driving and accelerating change. And I look forward to learning from all of you and partnering with you to build this new world that we need.
Good afternoon from New York City. I'm Tetsushi Sonobe, Dean and the CEO of Asian Development Bank Institute and the chair of Think7, the think tank engagement group of G7 Japan. About 2 months ago, I had a dream in which I was inviting Prime Minister Modi and the Prime Minister Kishida as G20 president and the G7 president, so to this room, and then they would shake hand and they issued a kind of joint call to SDG and climate actions to the world. But that dream didn't come true. Instead, we are having this equally impactful meeting. Thank you very much for joining us. And I'm very happy to have this great people in this room. And thank you very much, Rockefeller Foundation, and also ADBI for putting together this great meeting. Thank you very much. I stop here.
Good afternoon. My name is Sujan Chenoy. I'm the Think20 chair for India's G20 presidency. In my normal avatar, I'm the Director General of one of India's largest think tanks, the Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses. But it does more than defense and security, because security is seen by us as a more holistic, and non-traditional security is also part of our charter. Having said that, let me say that this is a wonderful opportunity to meet up again in New York in the Bellagio format. And I want to thank not just the Rockefeller Foundation, but also my colleague, Dean Tetsushi Sonobe, the T7 chair, and all the others who actually contributed very actively to making the G20 presidency of India a huge success. And that success really belongs to all of us, the think tank community. I am firmly convinced that notwithstanding the doubts that had been expressed through the last year about the G20's ability to come up with some kind of a consensus document, we actually did it in Delhi. And I think that was driven in large measure by the consensus being achieved among the experts and the think tanks. And I'm sure that also played a huge role in convincing governments that they had a similar stake in ensuring that we are truly one, Earth, one family, one future kind of concept. The Prime Minister of India had said at the G20 summit, and I think that's very important to note that the pledge that was taken, earlier, the resolution on SDGs, we must now work to bring that pledge to fruition. And he also called emphatically for a human-centric approach. And I think having got the G20 consensus in the Delhi Declaration, we must do our utmost to take that forward, to actually progress, for it's not just a piece of paper, and it's not a one-off event. And so we have a benchmark, and if there were one dream team that the world could think of today, it's the G20. It's a very inclusive team, simply for the fact that it has the G7, it has the BRICS, it has the IBSA, it has the major powers, 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And so the uniqueness of the G20 also lies in its tremendous outreach. Not just the fact that in Delhi we had 9 more invitee countries and a number of international organizations, but in the Think 20, we involved really the whole world. And I'm speaking also for my friend, Mr. Sonobe, because I could see that he did his utmost to reach out in a similar manner under the T7 banner. So I think we should use this opportunity to re-emphasize the work that has already been done so far. A couple of key points that emerged in the G20 require our attention. The needle has been, focused once again at the G20 summit, and I'm glad it happened, on SDGs. And so therefore, having done that, we need to also ensure that all the SDGs are taken to fruition. And one of the most important of these, one of the most important is gender equality and participation of women in the economy, the global economy, and the national economies as well. And India, I might inform you, has just in the lower house, which is the one that legislates more powerfully, passed a women reservation bill reserving 33% of all seats in parliament for women. And so that, I think, is extraordinary. The glass ceiling in India's largest parliamentary body has been broken, and the world's most populous democracy has shown the way forward. I'm sure many other countries would like to do likewise, remove the glass ceilings. We need to also look at the other major achievements of the G20 and take them forward, the AU's inclusion, and also focusing attention on generating different kinds of finance, lowering the cost of that finance. But I don't want to go into details at this stage. Suffice it to say that we should once again join hands together to take this process forward. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Chinoi, thank you so much. Good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon, or good night. For those who are following up online, I'm Nicolas Pichou, with the advisor to the Dean of ADBI. I was privileged to have been working in a T20 context, this group of think tanks in the G20 in the past few years, and in the past year, very steadily also in the context of the G7 Japan and the T7 Japan. And thank you very much for joining this meeting. This meeting is not a normal meeting. It looks like a meeting with people sitting around the table, like any other meeting. But in fact, what we are trying to achieve here at the headquarters of the Rockefeller Foundation, which has been tremendously helpful, thanks to Deepali and the team in supporting this converging conversation, right, which is so important. We have been working across the clock and across continents among think tanks, right? And it was already something to achieve that think tanks from all regions and the G20, as was reminded us by Ambassador Chinoi, as the common ground, but also G7 in times of some geopolitical changes or tensions, not only continue to speak together, but also manage to find together some points where convergence is absolutely needed. And we could speak for hours, but the result of so many conversations, one of them is that, and it will not be a surprise, we cannot let the 2030 agenda, which is clearly in disarray, slip out of our hands. Meanwhile, there are many factors that would help contribute the Agenda 2030 to be further damaged, right? And what you said, Elizabeth, about poverty, return of extreme poverty, meaning that hundreds or dozens of millions are falling back into durable poverty traps, hunger, right? We thought that this was something from the past, but they are not, definitely not. And it would be a grave mistake to think that it's just in a number of deprived or very low income countries, but in the global north, we have this in our cities and everywhere. So this was the conversation of think tanks, but then we are reaching also some limitations, because initially we're thinking about a call for action, then think tanks would call others to take action. Think tanks need to take action together, which we are doing, and we had a meeting about that this morning. Then we thought there are very powerful trends ongoing about development finance, impact finance, such as with the launch of the Global South Impact Investment Community and so on. Let's find the time, since a lot of institutions and stakeholders are gathering in New York at the occasion of the UN General Assembly and the SDG Summit, to sit around together for an hour and a half, 2 hours. We'll finish on time at 3 p.m. And I know you all have very, very constrained schedules. Let's sit around together. We will not come up together with magical solutions or miraculous solutions, but the seeds we want to plant today are about making bridges, building bridges, and if possible, manage to open ways in the way that all concepts are working to enhance the ability of working together and across those different, sometimes silos. And I want to thank, among others, also here at Sabeti next to me, with the 4th Sector Group, who has been also tremendously helpful, is an advocate of this convergence and economic transformation. And we have really tried to organize this discussion of today in that regard. So with no further notice, unless there are any kind of very urgent note or remark, we would like to start with Professor Bambang Brojonegoro, who was the T20 Indonesia chair and formerly also Minister of Finance of Indonesia, to kind of give us a sense, also from his exchange with the Indonesian delegation to the UN General Assembly and the SDG Summit, about where we are standing, and then we will initiate the conversation. The only rule for this afternoon is very, very simple. We are not here to pitch for ourselves. We are here really to share insights, insightful ideas. All the people who are sitting around the table, they are heading or they are part of powerful networks and organizations. So let's make sure that we make those connections, and then we will be following up afterwards. Professor Bambang, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicola. Very good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Let me try to give you the brief about SDG's achievement in Indonesia so far. As you know, SDG has the deadline, which is 2030. We are now 7 years from 2030, and let's see where we are, especially from the country case here in Indonesia. My former deputy in National Development Planning supposed to deliver this message or presentation, but she cannot come to join this meeting. So let me do on her behalf. And especially I was Minister of National Development Planning that initially trying to create the SDG process in Indonesia. So if we look at the Asia Pacific, very unfortunate that up until 2022, the progress was only 14%. And then if we look goal by goals, the 17 goals of SDGs, majority is in blue, which is good, meaning there are progress, but the progress still below the target of 2022. And especially on the climate action, Asia Pacific has big loss because we basically are in deficit when it comes to the climate action. While for others, we have some progress, but again, the progress is not yet up to our target in 2022. In the case of Indonesia, when I was the minister, I'm trying to classify all the 17 goals of SDG into 4 pillars. Social pillar, economic pillars, environmental pillar, justice and governance pillar. And each one of them has its own indicators. In total, Indonesia developed 289 indicators from the 17 goals. From 289 indicators, 67 until 2021, unfortunately, do not have sufficient or available data or information. So that's why we are only focusing now on 222 indicators. Out of 222 indicators, at least 63% already categorized as achieved by 2022, 63% of that. While 22% or 48 indicators still need special attention and require acceleration. And then if we look by pillars, the most progressive pillar in Indonesia, at least environment pillar, because 81% already achieved in terms of their indicators. The least would be in social pillars, poverty and also inequality, in which only 52% already achieved their target in 2022. So what have we done in Indonesia in order to accelerate SDG 2030? Of course, Indonesia is quite a big country with many islands. We are the largest archipelagic country in the world. And our challenge is how to make sure everybody, especially at the local level, will follow, the central government intention to accelerate SDG 2030. And the way we did is by so-called localizing SDG, by helping them formulating local action plan, as well as setting up SDG centers, and also SDGs on the village level. So for example, now we already have 32 local action plan for SDGs out of 34 provinces in Indonesia. And then we already established 40 SDG center, network, or hub that will really help local government to do not only formulating the policy, but also how to disseminate SDG into, the residents or majority of the people. And then central government also has direct transfer from central government to the village. And by doing that with village fund, then we try to make sure, even at the village level, they will try to comply with certain SDG goals. And then, of course, there are challenges when it comes to the policy. One challenge is how to minimize the potential conflict of goals. For example, when we are talking about water, of course, water is one of the basic thing in our life. Water will be very useful for promoting agriculture productivity through irrigation. Food security will be dependent on water. On the other way, water will be needed for renewable energy, clean energy, especially on hydropower. But then water is water, limited. So that's why when we make the policy to achieve SDG 2030, we have to optimize resource management while minimizing environmental impact and trying to progress across multiple SDGs, multiple goals, so ultimately leading to sustainable and resilient development. Last but not least, we have to talk about the financing, because we know after COVID-19 disruption, then there was a big shortage of SDG financing. So we have to do so-called innovative financing. What kind of innovative financing that Indonesia has been doing? Certainly from 2018 to 2021, we already issued 4 global green sukuk. Sukuk is Islamic bonds, and 3 retail green sukuk. So at least we are trying to link our financing from the market into certain projects that will qualify for the green growth or green development. And then on September 2021, we already issued SDG bonds for the first time, 500 million euro. So this, Indonesia is basically the first country in the Asia to issue SDG bonds in euros. And what will be the program that using this SDG bonds? For example, basic vaccination for new inborn baby, scholarship for elementary school, as well as internet access for majority of areas in Indonesia. And last but not least, we just issued 20.7 billion Japanese yen in terms of SDG blue bonds. I mean, samurai bonds, but in terms of the blue bonds. So at least we are trying to find a solution despite the lack of the source of financing for development in general. Thank you very much, Nicola.
Thank you so much. I think this is a very, very clear and precise example of SDG transformation and ways forward. So we have a couple of comments that I would like to hear from Robert Metzger, the head of sustainability and strategy innovations from Philips, and also with the foundation. Laurel Patterson, thank you very much also for joining, the director of SDG integration at UNDP. Hirat Sabeti, the founder and CEO of Fourth Sector Group. So based upon what are the objectives of this meeting, what you heard also, you were all in the past days in dozens of meetings, right, related to those very questions regarding the role of the private sector and building bridges so as to strengthen the weakest points of the SDG 2030 and the way to deliver on the SDGs and the Agenda 2030. Who would like to start first? Maybe Robert, very briefly.
I will. Thanks so much for having me. It's a great pleasure. I applaud the global think tanks to come together and really join the forces. I mean, we have been on this journey for a long time. You have been on this journey for a long time. So it's really great to see how this converges. I recall a meeting in the Bellagio setting 4 years ago, where we were talking about how to unleash the power of global supply chains to really drive decarbonization, for instance, in healthcare, where we are very active, and how we can use the power of supply chains to benefit businesses. And unleash the purchasing power in excess of hundreds of billions of euros or dollars globally. And it's good to see the ripple effects and how this movement is building and how you are contributing to this type of thinking to really bring industry, think tanks, governments, and NGOs together. Maybe you said very briefly, let me be brief. I'm excited in this week. I think there's a lot of progress going on. Looking ahead, I just want to mention there are a couple of important points where we can continue to team up. You will continue to team up. COP is one of them, but also Davos is coming up. We are coordinating and supporting the SDG 10 going forward. Some of you may know Feike Siebesma. He's our chairman at Philips. So happy to see from our side how we can continue to support this important work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I remember also that last year during UNGA, right, you were a number of foundations and the like sitting together about having this development finance, which is massive, right, globally, also converge to have a more, I would say, coordinated support to the SDGs. So that's very important. Maybe Hirat next, who would like to say a few words also briefly.
Thank you so much, Nicolas. So I'll just provide a little bit of an arc to help people navigate how we all ended up in this room. So Robert mentioned the Bellagio meeting 4 years ago. There's a couple of them that we convened that year. One was focused on unleashing the power, the purchasing power of corporates at scale to create demand for basically a new economic paradigm, businesses and finance that is fully SDG aligned. And then later that year, we had another session focused on systems change, the need to think about not these problems at the sort of branch level, climate change, inequality. A lot of the big challenges that we're dealing with are basically symptoms of a problem. And the problem is an economic system that was designed for extraction. So GDP growth basically means growing an extractive model of the economy. And so this pivot from growing GDP to growing quality of life is really important. We've been convening also folks in philanthropy. Nancy Lindborg is here. Rakesh is here. We have a number of folks from convenings over the last couple of years of funders and of donors. And I hope Rolf is with us from the OECD. Maybe he can share some context from that perspective, the OECD DAC. But basically, there is increasingly, since COVID especially, an awareness that fundamentally the root cause of the challenges we're dealing with is a system architecture that needs to be corrected. And so the question becomes, how do we address that? And the answer to that question, important as it is far too complex for any one person or institution to even understand, much less tackle. So it requires intersectional, convergent, integrated thinking, which is why bringing think tanks, global think tanks, together to combine their sort of sense-making capacity to inform that process for governments and other actors is really, really critical. It also requires investment in innovation. And of course, the thinking requires investment as well. So philanthropy and development finance are sort of low-hanging, if you think about it, low-hanging fruit pools of capital that are intended to be SDG aligned, intended to be solving the problems, but they can't unless they address the underlying systemic crisis. So we thought it would be good to bring some of these communities together today and see what sparks fly out of it. And I'm really delighted to have this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All the more that Ambassador Chino was referring to immediate outcomes, sort of the G20 summit in Delhi, but something that was floating around before and that was sort of enhanced all throughout the past months is this life economy, but also the ways that this has infused also a new approach to revive the SDGs precisely, right? With a very strong outcome of the development ministers meeting that took place in Varanasi. And the question is how to build on that, because sometimes great initiatives stem from one cycle or one presidency, and then there are other priorities coming up, etc. And this is a bit forgotten, but we also understand that we are both in needs of enhancing our ability to understand complex ongoing transformations, but also that it is not possible to put in the dump waste half or 80% of what is done during a cycle because it corresponds to some priorities, and then restart everything again. Our proposal is that this question of the strengthening, rebooting, reigniting, as we have said, the 2030 agenda is among the questions that need consolidation over time, which require also a lot of flexibility and understanding of different viewpoints. And also capabilities. For this, we will get back to that in a second, but we're also very grateful to our sort of our new partners, if I may say so, from the African Union, and especially the African Union Development Agency, because one very important change also on the global agenda is that the African Union has become a new member of the G20, which opens up also new ways probably to address the same questions. Laurel Patterson, would you like maybe to also, since you are very much into these SDGs and also as with the UN body, maybe share a few of your impressions, both about the relevance, hopefully, of this approach and discussion we are starting to see here in New York, but also from the past few days in the aftermath of both the G20 summit, but also the BRICS summit in South Africa, which was an important milestone, along with the climate summit in Nairobi. So we have a very, very dense global agenda link connecting sometimes with our subjects. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and it's really great to be here. And already several of the perspectives that I wanted to share certainly echo with what's been put on the table. Three reflections I wanted to share from our perspective and what we've seen over the past few days. So first, I think we've heard, and this room has already sort of highlighted this need for urgent action, urgency. But I think what's really important going forward in the second half is we continually remind ourselves that acceleration is not a direction. You can accelerate straight into a wall. We don't want to do that. We don't have time for that. And what that means fundamentally is leveraging these systems perspectives of the agenda. But it also means connecting with things that sometimes that get overlooked or certainly underinvested, and that's in our data and our evidence base. We know overall 15% of the goals are on progress. Frankly, we only collect data with an internationally recognized methodology for 140 targets. So as much as we know, there's a lot we don't know. And what we don't know is people. it's their experiences, it's the state of the planet where they're living, biodiversity, where they are, and so on. So I think it's really important as we move into the second half, this can't be a disconnected discussion, one of data, evidence, which sits somewhere else, and one of systems and progress that sits somewhere else still. So that to me is fundamental, and I think an important topic to be put on the table. And this is where technology, AI, there's so many ways that we can bridge those gaps smarter, faster. But nonetheless, it's really, really important. Otherwise, without a sense of direction, it's very difficult to identify what are those leverage points, what are the acupuncture points across the SDGs that we can make progress. Point number one. Number two, from our perspective, I think we need to take care in this space of possibility and hope. So we heard a lot about that, possibility and hope. It's possible. It is. It is. But for us to be able to achieve what's required in the next 7 years requires a lot of focus. So it's not everything everywhere all at once. And one of UNDP's initiatives coming into this summit was to work with 95 countries to try to identify those leverage points that make sense for them. We started with their data, we started with their national ambition, and then we started mapping against the SDG interlinkages. What are those opportunity spaces? And some things that probably wouldn't surprise a group like this, but nonetheless, is how important growth and jobs are in so many contexts. And so when we created these reports, we weren't only focused on accelerators, opportunities, pathways, et cetera, but what was holding those back. And I think when we look at a world where growth is extremely constrained for many countries, choices are constrained. And when that happens, we see poverty reversals. So in the reports across 95 countries, only 1 in 5 had reversed poverty, had made real poverty gains since 2019. And out of 95 countries, 72 economies actually increased their emissions over that period of time. And transitions are expensive, you know, and they don't happen on their own. So to me, what's really important is that we move forward with coalitions like this, and we start saying where are the leverage points that work for countries that meet their ambition, those areas they're already investing. And this is where I feel we've just not read the SDGs in the way that we could have, which is its interlinkages, which is that exact systems perspective. Third point for a group like this is coalitions. I don't think there's any other way to move forward. It often gets said, it definitely gets said in a UNGA week every year, but I think trying to figure out in a very specific, intentional and evidence-based way, what can different partners bring to these discussions around jobs, institutions, resilient infrastructure, the financing behind it, and energy transition. I think we need to get really, really granular coming out of spaces like this so that our action adds up quickly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And about this question of coalition, this is certainly not new, but it's not needed. Something that may be coming from the, say, the wealth of discussions and intense discussions over the past months among the think tanks community, right? Specifically, is that about those coalitions and partnerships is how to broaden is one question, but also how policy making can be strengthened out of those coalitions, because sometimes it's a lot of about advocacy, which is necessary. But then we find also that the expertise which triggers action, and the more we are going into climate finance and different aspects of climate finance and energy transition, the more there are very specific also fields of action, right? Which sometimes are not directly connected with those coalitions, and they are being driven by other constituents, which is fine, but then how not to lose sight of the main objective. So these are more questions, but also there is a raising awareness that solutions need to be found. So today we are also fortunate because Rodrigo Rollenberg, the Secretary of Green Economy, Decarbonization and Bioindustry from Brazil, is joining us, and he's currently being helped with the translation, and we will get to Rodrigo in a few minutes. But before that, I wanted to ask kindly Amar Bhattacharya, Amar Bhattacharya from the Brookings Institution, who is playing a tremendous role in sort of activating climate finance at large, but also promoting this transformation in the global financial architecture. From this viewpoint, to give your impression about the relevance of having this multi-stakeholder conversation, but also about one specific point, and we can also touch on this later in our discussion. Sometimes that there's the SDGs here, the climate finance here. They are not connected. This is something also that Bang Bang touched upon, and how to avoid that this discrepancy is being enlarged. And this is clearly something that is on the table also in the preparation of the G20 Brazil. Amar, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Nicola, and I'm going to just build on what Laurel just said. We are at a moment of, I would say, great hope and opportunity, but as she also said, great urgency and potential inertia. So overcoming that, what does it entail? So I think it's fair to say that we've had now really good reflections from a number of different tracks on two things. What needs to be done, financing for what, as I call it, but also solutions. And this has come from Bridgetown, it has come from the SDG stimulus plan, it's come from the Paris Pact, the new Global Financing Pact. It has come very centrally also from the reflections that are going on the role of multilateral development banks and more broadly the development finance system. There is a discussion right now happening on the World Bank Evolution Roadmap. We are associated with the reform of the system as a whole through the G20 MDB expert group and the Africa Climate Summit, then Marrakesh, then COP28. So this is a year of kind of recognition of the scale and the nature of the challenges, but also potential solutions. So in that context, I want to really go to what you were saying, which is, in the link between climate and development, that we have to recognize that if we fail on one, we will fail on the other. And the solutions are intimately linked because it is built around sustainable infrastructure. And sustainable infrastructure is about system change, as Laurel was pointing. So we need essentially investment frameworks with innovation that can bring about the scale of change and the quality of the investments that are necessary in order to produce the solutions that we are looking for. And in that world, I think I want to emphasize the key kind of solutions that are being put on the table right now, or the key challenges. One is the centrality of having investment frameworks that can go to scale. There are specific to country circumstances, but build on what we call now country sector platforms, country-led platforms for scaling up. Second, there is great urgency to tackle the debt and fiscal space constraints that countries are facing. Otherwise, we will not be able to make any progress on the SDGs. And we are not doing that right now. Third, we have to remember that the bulk of the resources continue to come from domestic sources, and we have to improve domestic resource mobilization, both public as well as private. Fourth, the multilateral development and the larger development finance system role needs to be stepped up greatly. We are calling for a tripling of the MDB system between now and 2030. And I think now that awareness is coming in, and how to do it is also coming in. And the fifth point I want to make is it's not just a question of private finance, but the role of the private sector has to change fundamentally, and the partnership between the official and the private sector has to change fundamentally. I say often that, we often talk about corporate social responsibility, but this is the time to talk about corporate planetary responsibility. When you think about the amount of wealth that lies in the private sector, and you think about what we need, it's a big question mark why the private sector, the corporate sector, is not providing more support. I made this very strongly here in the past few days here in New York. And the last point I want to end with, we will need significant amount of concessional finance. And waiting for that to come just from official development assistance is living in dream world. It's not going to happen. So we need to think about how do we get predictable sources of low-cost finance. And now there are some very, very good proposals on the table, ranging from voluntary carbon markets, use of compliance carbon markets, private philanthropy in this room, leveraging private philanthropy, combining sources of finance with the leveraging power of the MDB system, and yes, international taxation, particularly of things that are carbon generating and are not being taxed, like aviation and maritime sectors. So I think, there is a good agenda building. There's a process now building. I think the Indian G20 was very valuable. I thought the Paris summit was great. And I hope by the time we land in COP28, we will actually push this solution set in a way that it is about investment, it is about innovation, and it is about actions to mobilize the finance with all stakeholders. The think tank community has a crucial role in two ways. Not only kind of saying, look, here are the low-hanging fruit, but here are also accountability mechanisms, including data and benchmarks.
Thank you very much. This is very important. Yeah. And very strong messages. It's also very interesting because in the past decade, we have seen on the forefront, remember all the first paragraphs of the G20 declarations, they were always about growth. And from one year to another, it was, oh, growth is steady, growth is declining a little bit, we must restore growth, etc. We can see that this year, past year, things are being also changing, and then we cannot miss this window of opportunity. I saw that Dennis Noer, the president of the Global Solutions Initiative, wanted to say a word before we pass it on to Rodrigo Bollenberg. If there are any other short remarks, please raise your hand. We'll take them. Then we'll pass it on to our Brazilian distinguished guest. Please, Dennis.
Very briefly, just taking on what you have just concluded with. We have noticed year after year that we have lots of exhortations on how to improve. We have ideas on what solutions there would be to issue such improvement. If we look at our past progress in terms of climate change, biodiversity loss, tackling financial instabilities, tackling universal health coverage, and so on and so forth, the progress has simply been absolutely inadequate. We all feel the need to give hope, and that sometimes leads us to playing down the obstacles that we face. There are solutions on the table that come year after year, and they are not being implemented. The SDGs are out there, but if you talk to CEOs who are honest, they will say they make absolutely no difference to their business decisions. And the fact remains, and here this comes, I've got 4 short points. The first point is that, as a number of people here have remarked, the system is designed for something different. Our current system gives many CEOs the fiduciary responsibility to destroy the climate. That is not to be ignored. And therefore, the question, and that's my point number 1, is what is the rule book that we need to write so that businesses can pursue profit while at the same time promoting the environment and not undermining society? That type of discussion has not received sufficient emphasis. Point number 2, we will make no progress even once we have this rule book unless there is consistent measurement of prosperity beyond GDP. And that includes not only material living standards and environmental sustainability, it also includes solidarity of our communities and personal empowerment. Much of the proposals for climate action simply do not happen because they are designed by natural scientists and economists, and they are socially unacceptable. So unless we have consistent measurement, there is no hope of proceeding properly. Thirdly, we must, as policymakers, be aware that there is a need to specify a common goal, let's say net zero by 2050, but there will be different trajectories towards that goal, dictated by different social, political, economic circumstances. Trajectories have to be monitored. Milestones need to be set in accordance with the consistent measurement and reporting. And then there needs to be a system whereby there are rewards for good behavior and graduated sanctions for bad behavior. Voluntary contributions is just a lot of hot air. And therefore we need to agree on a system in which everyone is empowered to make rules towards these distinctive pathways, but then to be accountable for living by those rules. And that is a new way of thinking, and we have a long way to go before we reach that. And the last point is, in thinking about solutions, we should not try to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of solutions on the table. These solutions could provide a portfolio of choices whereby these distinct pathways can be followed. And if we can agree on consistent measurements and distinctive pathways, then policymakers at this global level could focus on the common goal and leave the instruments to that goal to the decision makers at national levels. So, for example, having a common goal of net zero by 2050, that's a common goal. But then to say, okay, the combustion engine has to be outlawed and so on, that is engaging in instruments, and those instruments are not at the supranational level. It is the monitoring that should be at the supranational level, not the implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denis. For those who are not familiar with the annual gathering of the Global Solutions Initiative in Berlin, this is the kind of discussions that we have been steadily try to follow, and part of this G7 interactions also greatly came from there. So please stay tuned and also share your contacts, etc., because we do want really to follow up on today's I would say multiple introductions. I would like to pass it on, and thank you very much, Denis, to Amin Idris Adoum, the director of the African Union Development Agency, to share a few words, and then really we need to hear our Brazilian guest.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
Briefly, please.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Nicolas, and good afternoon, everyone. In fact, I just wanted to comment on the comments I heard on financing, and especially green financing. One of the participants was mentioning the need to bring, I would say, charity organizations, MDBs, and so forth. I just want to share with you a report that we just published last week on the implementation of the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, which is quite interesting. We have expected initially $14 billion investment in infrastructure over a period of 10 years. We ended up with $82 billion investments. But the interesting part is that only 3% of this money come from private sector, 0 from charity. In fact, charity does not put money into structure, I would say, project that can structure and transform structurally the economy. They will put money into small projects like let's fix small health issues here, or there is an issue about famine or food security in a village, but that is not really the direction to go. We've been talking about charity for a long time. Let me share with you some of the numbers we've had. 42% of these 82 billion come from African member states themselves, directly from their national budget. That's number one. Number two, 24% come actually from what we call ICA, which is the Infrastructure Consortium Group for Africa. Those members are African Development Bank, ICA, MDBs, and World Bank Group. And this 24% is also not actually aid. It is really loan. It's, again, another debt. And then 24% come from direct loan from China, and 7% from various other sources, but only 3% come actually from private sector and 0% from charity. So when we talk about actually utilizing charity to finance development, we are just wondering at what are we talking about? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this is it for the first sets of insights. Now in Brazil, which will be hosting the G20 next year, it has even sort of started. These issues of transformation of the economy or new economy have been pushed very actively by the new administration, right? And this goes along the emergence of bioeconomy and other notions. So together with the Rodrigo Hollenberg, sorry, as the Secretary for precisely green economy, decarbonization, and bioindustry, which is one of the driving force of those transformations with the presidential administration. Please, can you share a few words about these ongoing processes, but also maybe you have heard on multiple occasions the ways so that interesting ideas and strong recommendations coming from the G20 India, especially on those aspects of transformations, could be further emphasized maybe in the coming months. The floor is yours. So just for the rest of us, Rodrigo will speak in Portuguese, Brazilian, and there is a simultaneous translation. I cannot thank enough our colleagues from the Rockefeller Foundation, because this was some of the biggest challenge on the way to this meeting. So what is your name? Natalia, thank you very much. We'll do the translation. So it might take a little bit of time, but I think it will be very much okay. And this was really worth taking the opportunity. So thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Muito obrigado. Muito boa tarde. Estou muito honrado em participar com vocês desse diálogo. Precisamos agir rápido e com intensidade. Estamos muito distantes de atingir os objetivos do desenvolvimento sustentável.
So good afternoon. I am really pleased and honored to be here with you in this conversation. We need to act with speed and intensity. We are very, very far away of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals.
A crise climática e o aquecimento global trazem ameaças para todo o planeta, mas as consequências mais graves são para os países mais pobres e com menos infraestrutura.
So the climate crisis and global warming bring threat to the entire planet, but the consequences, the most dire consequences, are for the countries that are the poorest and with less infrastructure.
As medidas protecionistas tomadas pelos países ricos tendem a agravar as desigualdades no mundo. Os países ricos não cumpriram seu compromisso de doarem $100 bilhões por ano para os países em desenvolvimento. Isso traz descrédito aos compromissos internacionais.
So the protectionist measures taken by rich countries tend to worsen the inequalities around the world. The rich countries did not follow their commitment to donate $100 billion a year for the developing world. This brings lack of credit to international commitments.
Se é urgente fazer uma transição energética e ecológica, é também indispensável que ela seja justa e inclusiva. Mas o que estamos vendo é o oposto disso. Os países ricos estão dando subsídios robustos para investimentos em seus países e criando barreiras comerciais para os produtos dos países em desenvolvimento.
If it is urgent to do an energetic transition and sustainable, it is also pressing that this transition is just and inclusive. But what we are seeing is the opposite of that. So the rich countries are giving subsidies, robust subsidies for investments in their own countries, and they are creating barriers, commercial barriers for the products from developing countries.
Temos que ter clareza Se os efeitos perversos das mudanças climáticas atingem a todos, as oportunidades também precisam ser compartilhadas. Temos que substituir os discursos pela ação. Falamos em cooperação, mas o que vemos é competição.
So we have to be clear here. If the perverse effects of climate change are reaching everyone, the opportunities coming from this also have to be shared. We have to replace speeches for action. We are talking a lot about cooperation, but what we are seeing is competition.
No Brasil, sob a liderança do presidente Lula e do vice-presidente Geraldo Alckmin, estamos fazendo nossa parte.
In Brazil, under the leadership of President Lula and Vice President Geraldo Alckmin, we're doing our share.
Ampliamos o Bolsa Família, que hoje beneficia 21 milhões de famílias, priorizando as mulheres e acrescentando R$ 150 por criança até 6 anos de idade, desde que estejam vacinadas e frequentando a escola.
We increased the Bolsa Familia, which is a cash transfer project that currently benefits 21 million families, prioritizing women and increasing 150 reais per child up to 6 years old, as long as they are vaccinated and attending school.
Aprovamos a Lei da Igualdade Salarial entre homens e mulheres, implementamos o aumento real do salário mínimo e reduzimos o desmatamento da Amazônia em 48% nos 8 primeiros meses de governo.
So we approved a law for pay equity between men and women. We implemented a real increase on the minimum salary, and we reduced the deforestation in 48% in the first 8 months of the government.
Criamos o Centro de Bionegócios da Amazônia, que está pronto para desenvolver produtos e negócios a partir da biodiversidade amazônica, gerando riquezas e benefícios para as comunidades tradicionais.
So we create the Centro de Bionegócios da Amazônia, Amazonian's Bio Business Center, that is ready to develop products and business based on the Amazonian biodiversity, generating wealth and benefits for the traditional communities.
As oportunidades de retorno econômico e impacto social nas comunidades é enorme na área de alimentos, alimentos funcionais, cosméticos, fitoterápicos.
So the opportunities for economic benefit and social impact in the communities is huge, especially in the food systems area, the food as medicine area, cosmetics, and medicine and traditional medicine.
Temos convicção de que a forma mais eficiente de manter a floresta em pé é gerando renda para quem nela habita. Para isso, precisamos de apoio.
We strongly believe that the most efficient way to keep the forest standing is generating wealth for those that live in it. For this, we need support.
Temos imenso potencial de receber empresas de todo o mundo que precisam acelerar seus processos de descarbonização com redução de custos, por termos energia renovável, abundante e barata.
We have an immense potential to welcome companies from around the world that need to accelerate their decarbonization processes with cost reduction, because we do have clean, abundant, and cheap sustainable energy.
E o que é melhor, oferecemos essas oportunidades em locais de baixo IDH, Índice de Desenvolvimento Humano, gerando empregos qualificados e bem remunerados, melhorando a qualidade de vida da população local.
And the best part is that we offer those opportunities in locals that have a low human development index, generating employment that is qualified and well paid, increasing the quality of life for the local population.
O Brasil está avançando nos seus marcos regulatórios. Aumentamos a mistura de biodiesel no diesel fóssil e vamos aprovar até o final do ano as regulamentações do mercado de carbono, diesel verde, combustível sustentável de aviação e hidrogênio de baixo carbono.
So Brazil is also moving forward in its regulatory stance. So we increased the mixture of biodiesel in the fossil diesel, and we are going to approve by the end of the year regulation for the market, for the carbon market, for green diesel, for sustainable fuel, for aviation, and for low carbon hydrogen.
Recentemente, criamos a N Impacto, Estratégia Nacional de Impacto, que busca estimular oportunidades de investimentos e negócios que tragam retorno financeiro e impacto ambiental e social nas comunidades.
So recently we created an Impacto, which is the national strategy for impact that aims to stimulate the opportunity for investments and business that bring financial return and environmental impact and social impact for the communities.
Temos oportunidades gigantescas na transição energética e na bioeconomia, mas precisamos de apoio e financiamento. O Brasil pode contribuir para os objetivos do desenvolvimento sustentável sejam alcançados. O Brasil é um grande destino para investimentos de impacto econômico, social e ambiental.
We have huge opportunities for the energy transition and bioeconomy, but we need support and funding. Brazil can contribute to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Brazil is a great destination for investments, for social impact, for economic impact, and also environmental impact.
Thank you. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado. Thank you very much. Well, it's very interesting because when we hear the, I'll say the detail of the political roadmap that is being approved and implemented, when we hear Professor Bang talk about the whereabouts of the SDGs in the context of Indonesia, which is, as you say, not a small country, starting with the size. But we hear also Ambassador Chinoy referring to a number of new directions, including gender equality, right? We can see that, as Dean Sonobe was referring, factors of hopes, they are really here. So it's not that we are doomed and it's just talking about everything is crumbling and falling apart. But we also understand that the factors, and this was very clearly referred to both by Amar Bhattacharya and by Dennis Nower, the factors of tensions and models that are pre-existing, as Hirat was also saying, that do not lead us to the right directions, are imposing upon us a strong toll, right? And very strong constraints. Probably the way that the G20 is growing with integrating the African Union might be a way also to implement new ways to move towards sets of solutions. Some of them we already know. I would like to continue the discussion today. And again, please feel free. There is no mode d'emploi. Please feel free to ask for or share your insights with the floor in the next 45 minutes. But otherwise, I would like to ask maybe two persons in the room, Jorge Moreira da Silva, the Executive Director of UNOPS. Thank you very much also for joining us. Maybe also Melissa Stevens, the Executive Vice President of Philanthropy at the Milken Institute. And I see also others when I'm thinking about Ambassador Chinoy and Anna Katina Heinrich, okay, to maybe react to what Rodrigo Rollenberg explained about the current transformations in Brazil, but also how we might be smarter together when we get out of this room. Jorge, if you would like.
Thank you, and apologies, I couldn't follow the first part of the discussion, but I've been involved in this initiative in my previous roles. I just joined the UNOPS 5 months ago, and you would understand that I would bring today an element that is regarding operations. So we've been discussing on this stock taking on the 2030 agenda, finance and policy. And policy is particularly important when related with the root causes of the symptoms that we are all discussing. That's why the concept of economic systems transformation is so fundamental. So finance alone won't fix the problem. We need enabling context, and enabling context requires reforms to address systems transformation and not just the band-aid or the firefighting, the addressing the symptoms. But there is a third element that maybe it's been overlooked, and it's where I put my current head as head of UNOPS, that is the agency on operations, that is the capacity for implementation. Even if you get all the finance that is needed, and we don't have it, and even if you have all the reforms that are fundamental to address the ecosystem's transformation, if you don't have the capacity for implementation, if the technical capacity is not there, if you don't have the ability to generate bankable projects, we will miss the 2030 agenda and the climate action. So I'd like to add this element. This element has been overlooked in all the discussions and negotiations. We keep focus on the speed meter and on how much we spend, and also on these elements regarding policy reforms that I think is fundamental. But I would call your attention also for your third element, that is the capacity for implementation and the role that UN agencies and development agencies and MDBs have in providing all the capacity for implementation so that we can generate bankable projects. If I may also have one second point, especially looking forward and not doing the review or the assessment of this current week, because I think that you had already had the chance to discuss the outcome of the climate discussions, the SDGs, also the UNGA. I think that we cannot miss the opportunity of our common agenda and the Summit of the Future. The Summit of the Future and our common agenda is focused on the how, not on the what or the what for. The what and the what for is very clearly outlined on the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. You know the what and the what for. We know that on the Addis, on Paris, and on the 2030 agenda. But clearly something has been missing, because we have been expecting that the what and the what for to be generated through policies that countries put in place. Clearly, the cooperation dimension has been missing on the policy, and that's why I think that the Secretary General, when he issued this initiative of our common agenda, is to go further on the how, not to bring a prescriptive approach to tell countries what to do, because this is up to countries to decide what's their development pathways, but to generate a consensus among all countries and civil society, private sector, philanthropy on the key transitions. And the key transitions that UN has been discussing and will be at the core of the Summit of the Future, it's about the triple planetary crisis, climate, biodiversity, pollution. It's about narrowing the digital divide, 3 billion people offline, addressing the energy transition when we still have more than 600 million people without access to electricity, and developing countries only attracting 1% of all the investments needed in renewable energy. The fourth is social protection, decent job creation, equality. The fifth, it's on the food systems. Then we have transformative education and health. So I think that this initiative that we have been discussing, bringing together G7, G20, T7, T20, philanthropy, governments, private sector, could be a source of inspiration for our common agenda. So I would clearly incentivize you, if I may, now that I'm in the other side of the street, to be very active, because I think that it can be really inspiration. Thank you.
Jorge, thank you very much. So I will pass it to Melissa Stevens. And if you allow me, Anna Katarina, before passing it to you, I would like to hear also what Mamadou Biteye from the Africa Capacity Building Foundation could share with us. But Melissa.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, for the invitation to be here today. And so I'm with the Milken Institute, and while the Milken Institute we are technically a think tank, we're also a lot of connective tissue. So I really appreciate this conversation around needing to bring all the different sectors together and to link arms to make more progress. As I've heard some of the comments this morning and appreciated all of them, a couple of things that really resonate with me. One, around the resource mobilization. We've heard a little bit about the need for private philanthropy, and agree 100%. And obviously we've had a number of private philanthropies in here. I think there's also untapped private philanthropy in the smaller foundations, in the families and the family offices here in the States, in Asia and others. And a number just aren't using the SDG framework as a way to organize their philanthropy. So I think there is an untapped market there and an opportunity to educate, to lean into the intersectionality of issues, to find what they care about, how that relates to the overall framework and the goals. And I love the acupuncture point comment and doing the systems mapping and bringing folks along for that journey for them to be really invested in this in a new way. So I would make that one observation, that I think that is an untapped market. The other is I appreciated the comment about CEOs have the fiduciary responsibility to destroy the climate, and we need to rewrite the rule book. And when I think about that, I think the opportunity to rewrite the rule book is with the institutional investors, with the sovereign wealth funds, with the pensions, with private equity, that can really, they can rewrite it. And we've seen that happen. We've seen one food investor say, I will not invest in your company if you have antibiotics in your meat. And I think that's just one example, but I think being able to speak to and galvanize and educate that community as well is an opportunity to start to rewrite that rule book. I'll invoke Mike Milken just for a moment, who likes to say the best investor is a social scientist. And I would just update that by saying the best investor is a social scientist and environmental scientist as well. And so that's the world that we live in. And I think a real opportunity to engage those communities even more substantially.
Thank you very much. Let me also say, incidentally, that you should have this document called Working Document 1, a global contribution from think tanks, on your tables. This is a document that we have designed ahead of this cycle of discussions we are having today. It's not just here for the show or just to put documents on the table. You are all invited. Kaori Itomi next to me will take your contact details. We have your contact details, but you are all invited, should you want to share a contribution. And after this meeting, and probably in the course of next week, hopefully, or in the next 10 days, we will recirculate to everyone working document number 2. That will not become an encyclopedia. We want to keep it very short, 4 pages maximum, trying to make a synthesis out of the inputs, insight, remarks, recommendations. So it's not about a catalog of good ideas. It's really about enriching this portfolio of ways to look at the same problem from different angles, but at the same moment, and aligning capabilities. So just wanted to mention that. Feel free to, it's more than free, it's an invitation for you to contribute. So continuing this discussion, Mamadou Biteye, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Mamadou Biteye, head of the African Capacity Building Foundation, but also formerly head of Africa for the Rockefeller Foundation. So I want to take the opportunity to thank Dipali and the Rockefeller Foundation for keeping that tradition of really creating platforms for multi-stakeholder and multidisciplinary conversations around issues that matter. On this conversation, I wanted to just mention 2 points to add. Because for those who don't know the African Capacity Building Foundation and the linkage to think tanks, it has been supporting policy making in Africa. And ACBF has created from scratch over 35 think tanks that live within ministries of finance and planning to support evidence-based policy making. And also coordinates the Africa Think Tank Network and is the convener of the annual Africa Think Tank Summit, which brings over 65 African think tanks. So this is why it's very important for me to raise the issue of really priorities on all the advocacy that has been talked about here on this document, the issue of capacity as well, particularly of African think tanks, to conduct demand-driven research on the African continent to support policy and regulatory work. Today, when you look at many of the big areas of impact, particularly a lot has been said about energy transitions. It's less than 30% of all research around energy transitions in Africa that is being conducted by Africa-based researchers, whether it's think tanks, universities, etc. Most of the research comes from other organizations that are not Africa-based, which is a big issue. Which makes sometimes this research maybe not fully based on reality on the ground or responding to the key questions that actually policymakers and other local actors are really grappling with to address that. So I think that I really welcome this, and as a specialized agency of the African Union, and also a knowledge partner of the African Union, particularly for its participation in the G20. We think that one of the efforts is really promoting partnership and capacity building across country and cross disciplines between think tanks in Africa and think tanks in other continents, and linking that particularly to policy making and regulation. So I think that this is one thing that we need to prioritize. The second point, which I will go on very quickly, I think was already touched on by the gentleman from UNOPS. There is a lot of, for attainment of the SDGs, there is some progress, but the biggest challenge in Africa is not just the resources, as he said. The World Bank itself has doubled its the resources put at the disposal of African countries. But the biggest challenge is capacity, absorption capacity, which is extremely low. A lot of these resources earmarked, put at their disposal, are not utilized to advance the attainment of the SDG goals. And this speaks also to issues about institutional capacity in many of governments and institutions that are supposed to drive this work. So, and yet there is no funding for capacity building. So I wanted also just to urge ourselves to really not just look at financing of direct activities and impact areas, but actually really to support skills building, to support institutional capacity for absorption of those resources that could be mobilized, and put that really with a minimum standard maybe that can be pushed. What is a minimum percentage that in every funding should be devoted to that capacity to actually implement. Thank you. That was my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a very important and critical contribution. We were this morning with the rector of the United Nations University, and the director of UNU Institute for Advanced Studies is also here with us. I suggest that maybe Yamaguchi-sensei, we hear you after Anna Katarina, if you agree. Anna Katarina, please.
Yeah, thank you, Nicola. Anna Katarina Hornitsch. I'm the director of the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, in short, IDOS. Some of you might know the institute under the name DIE, German Development Institute, as we cooperate with some of your organizations. I want to thank Mr. Rollenberg for your contribution and underline the message of putting the social into the center of the discussions. And we earlier also this morning had heard from the African Union, from Amin Adoum, a similar statement. We've discussed it out of the Indonesian context as well earlier with your keynote. I think we all have immediately examples in our mind. We know that we observe social polarization processes interestingly, across all continents and in all types of countries, income levels of countries, since a number of years. In quite a number of countries, this also tips into political autocratization processes. We, as we all know, live in a world where 72% of the world population live in autocracies according to the Varieties of Democracy Index. And I think we need to see this and put this substantially more into the center of our conversation when we think about the Sustainable Development Goals or climate and, you spoke of the triple crisis: climate, pollution, biodiversity. The social has to be center stage. If we do not address the social question, we will not move forward. I think you mentioned it in a similar way, but we are focusing on the social question very much out of a financial, fiscal space, financial instruments perspective. I think you gave many examples of what putting the social actually means in the context of building social security systems, building healthcare systems, investing into education systems, and with this investing into social cohesion. And I want to underline this for our discussions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anna Katarina. And must say also that Anna Katarina, together with Dennis Noer, were sort of instrumental last year during the G7 Germany in answering the call from the T20 chair, Bambang Brojonegoro, in so saying we need to really push this convergence, not force it, but push it and build it, starting with think tanks. So that is this is very important, especially because this question of not just capacity, but capacity building, and Mamadou, if I may call you, is what you say about absorption capacity, I think is absolutely critical, because you can put a lot of funding or a lot of good ideas on the table. If no one is in a capacity to absorb them and turn them into policy tools, right? This will not reach its goals. And I think this is very important, because for think tanks and research institutions, etc., it's also a matter of durable credibility. And that's deserves a lot of attention. Maybe Professor Yamaguchi with the United Nations University, you want to echo this perspective? It should work, the mic should work.
Yeah.
Yes, please go on.
Thank you very much, Nicolas-san, and good afternoon, everyone. And well, during this SDG summit, having heard that only the 15% of the target has been achieved, so we are relatively pessimistic, but I just want to share a bit of the optimistic side in terms of the how the think tank network, global network can contribute, the power of the think tank network influencing the international, the policy, the framework. And as this, the working paper mentioned about the shared priority and indicating this biodiversity, the framework, the Kumi Montreal, the global biodiversity, the framework. And this agreement, in fact, is very important, not only to halt the biological loss, but also it is really the promoting this whole society approach in the collaborating different stakeholders. And in fact, the United Nations University, we have a network of 300 organizations that including well, the local government, but research institute and higher educational, the institute, to collaborate. We accumulated the good example, best practices for the last decade. And we brought those evidence to the base, the proof how the think tank can really contribute to the biodiversity COP15 last December. And in fact, the DAO network called the International Partnership for the Satoyama Initiatives with the 300 organizations in 62 different countries, which covers all of those T7, T20, the countries, was found to be very powerful and influencing. And in fact, in this, for the next decade, the direction, this international the partnership is to promote the socio-ecological production landscape and seascapes, not only for the natural preservation, but also to protect the nature and environment and to maintain its contribution to the human well-being. So I would really suggest to utilize the currently available those international think tank network to influence this international the policy, the framework that is very much the possible, and also to add supplement the Laura's the argument of the importance of evidence-based the contribution. We had actually organized this the workshop discussing why there is a gap between the science and policy, because we always talk about the importance of science policy interface, but it is not happening. And actually UNDP and United Nations University were joined by the higher educational institution and also the research institute that we identified some of the issues, including those science policy, scientific data and research result is not accessible enough, to the users, and also capacity building of the government officials is not enough, because we do need an institutional actually capacity building for ongoing training through the ongoing training and dialogue. And we also identified the importance of contextualizing those data and the data and information. So all of those, dialogue among the representatives of the think tank and research institute has been contributing, to identify the issues and then how we can overcome. So I really want to believe that those powers of the international network, think tank network, located in different parts of the world. And I think T7, T20 can really enhance, those, the network influencing the important direction of the international, the policy framework. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's both important recommendations and important note. In fact, on the way to this meeting, we had the opportunity to have several exchanges with a number of the authors of the new Global Sustainable Development Report, right, which is a really important assessment, not just of the SDGs with how much they are well performing or not, but a comprehensive approach of this framework, including the question of science to policy interface, etc. And that very much echoes what is written in this paragraph. So we have about 15 minutes left ahead of us, and we really want to finish on time. We have a few friends and colleagues who are online. If you want to take part of the discussion and drop a note, please feel free to intervene at any time. I also wanted to say that it's not just to be polite with the host of this meeting, which is not the host, but the partner, Rockefeller Foundation, but we have had this Bellagio meeting with the think tanks in springtime. Here I'd refer to a number of convenings also in Bellagio in earlier times before the COVID. I see Heidi Hollowell must be listening to us, and Professor Bang Bang with the Global South Impact Community that was also initiated or incubated or launched at a meeting in Bellagio. So it's just to say that at some point, I think especially think tanks here, they need this joining forces, right, can greatly benefit each and every one of us. Providing a convening space is not enough, but without a convening space, which means also a safe space, right, to be able to exchange beyond our differences is absolutely critical in that moment. We can see that trust is an essential currency. If you don't have this, we can't talk to each other, right? Because the stakes are very high, and the potential benefits or harm of a wrong conversation, they are also very high. So I just wanted to say that, because this might give ideas to other. Yes, Anna Katarina, and then I would like to pass it on to Gaurav Gupta and Nancy Lindborg. And yes, but Anna Katarina, please.
Yeah,
briefly.
thanks. I'm not sure when else we would discuss this. That's why I'm asking it now. But I think it would be very important that we clarify what we are doing with this document. And my suggestion would be to now do the one more round that you've already said, no? Circulate, everyone can comment once more, but then finalize and then assure that all of us carry it into those discussion platforms that we are part of regarding the half midterm view onto the Agenda 2030, and then find also and identify with our partners from Brazil, also from Italy, the colleagues were present. I'm not sure whether they're still present right now, ways of basically continuing the dialogue in the coming year. But I think we need to, we need to settle on a process here.
Yes,
Thanks.
also, so if you allow me, maybe on that particular point, under the control of both Dean Sonobe, Ambassador Chinoy, and Deepali, the idea is the following, right? This served both as an input and way to consolidate a number of thoughts, which are considerably enriched by today's discussion. If anyone here would like really to provide an additional insight, it will be taken into account. And then there will be this working paper number 2. As you are taking part to this meeting now, you will be compelled to support this working paper number 2. No, of course not. But the idea of this working paper number 2 is to widely circulate and then to further aggregate some other insights. We are in a period of, I would say, intermediate period of time, right? The G20 summit in India is over. The G20 presidency of India is not over. We will be moving towards the G7 presidency of Italy, but that will be in the end of November, right? And for think tanks, there will be an important meeting convening in South Africa, where the T20 India will pass the baton to the T20 India. That is in 2 months from now. So our idea was also to avoid that everything sort of disappears in this period of time. On the contrary, Amar was mentioning there are other, I would say, very important convenings, starting with the COP28 coming up. So we want to aggregate, consolidate information, recommendations, and then have this as a common document, which can be used as a kind of open source. And then, depending on how things are turning, etc., the further opportunities, but of course, we will try to further strengthen those opportunities, especially together with Deepali. This could serve also as a basis for future discussions, convening, reinforcing that. And there will probably also be new opportunities arising for from the preparation of the G20 India. Well, I hope it is a clear answer. So let's say by the beginning of October, right, reasonably, this working document number 2 will be at your disposal. And really the idea is to try to also cross the lines. This is initially a think tank's contribution, but we are talking about development finance, we are talking about governance inputs, we are talking about climate finance, etc. So one way or another, we need to be able to have this appear, right, plainly.
And Nicola, maybe you can remember that the autumn conference of the World Bank starts on the 9th of October.
Yes, yes.
So it would be good if you can circulate it there, hand it over to colleagues.
Yes, yes,
Maybe
yes.
there's even something planned already, I'm not sure.
So we don't want to enter too long into that, but of course we have been intensely communicating with several World Bank representatives. This morning head of the G7, G20, MTB's relations was with us. And there will be channels of communications also with the World Bank and also with other multilateral financial institutions. Yes, that's absolutely important. I hope this is clear enough as an answer to this very important question. So you don't have to deal with that at the end or after the meeting is finished. So in the next couple of minutes, and please, if you still agree to be brief, I would like to ask Gaurav Gupta. Gaurav Gupta is the Global Managing Partner of Dalberg Advisors, and Nancy Lindborg, who is the President and CEO of the... Nancy is not with his, okay, no problem. So Gaurav, please, the floor is yours. Yes. And then Sanjeev, yes.
So again, thank you for inviting me. Actually, it's a great segue because I wanted to comment on this thing that says a global contribution from think tanks. And just as a bit of context, I'm not a think tank, we're not a think tank, but what we are people who have to constantly face clients. And actually our clients are telling us to build a think tank. So we're actually in the process of building one. And I want to actually reflect on that for this community, which is two observations. One, an institutional one. The pace of change is extremely rapid. And so as think tanks, your ability to get research out there in a usable format for the institutional layer has gone up exponentially, or needs to go up exponentially, sorry. Because we know that institutionally you've been working at a particular pace of deep research, which is always needed, but people need usable research yesterday very quickly. So one is just a reflection on how does the institutions themselves need to change, because why is it that consulting firms are being asked to build think tanks, right? And that's what we are being asked to do a lot. The second observation is when I went through the notes, really interesting about how you want to collaborate, but I often hear this idea that we should not be doing the same thing. Each of us does different things. I actually think to the question of how do you rewire the system itself, all of the advice we've ever done with clients, the one thing we are never able to change is their behavior if their incentives don't change. You will not achieve any institutional changes around the world if the incentive layer within those institutions doesn't change. So just as a challenge to put out there, what would it take if all the think tanks in the world focused on simply getting the carbon tax and other types of social taxes right? If everyone worked on the issue of pricing, because individually different people working on pricing here and there will not work, because the idea of incentives is an international problem. So if someone changes the incentives here, they'll lose out. So I do think as part of a coordination layer of think tanks, this idea of a global contribution, what are those global issues that every think tank in their different geographies has to be working on together to make a systems change happen? Would be really interesting to explore, and pricing or proper pricing is one of them.
Okay, thank you very much. So in the next minutes, let's hear what our colleague Sanjay Purohit, and then I will like to pass it on to Hirad. Also has a number of ideas shared with the T20 India about the way forward, including research, and then we will be closing our discussion. If Dean Sonobe want to say a final word, or Ambassador Chino, and then Deepali. So Sanjay?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, sorry.
I have an appeal and a recommendation. The appeal to the room of think tanks, T7, T20, continuing the discussion on thinking about exponential. I think the mathematician Albert Bartlett had said the greatest shortcoming of the human mind is the ability to think exponential. And I think we are suffering from that. I'll give you the example of SDG. If you think we're at the midpoint of SDG, between now and 2030, we have to improve at 10% per year. If you think we are at the 25% mark, then we have to improve at 20% per year. And if you think that we are at the 15% mark, we have to improve in the vicinity of 30% per year. But we don't understand that. My appeal to the think tank is that we should replace the vocabulary. We should bring the vocabulary and take it away from the normative. It's urgent, it's important. I think the sting of that vocabulary is over. What we need to multiply. We cannot fight an exponential goal with linear efforts. And in that context, I have a submission to make. coming out of the G20 and the Indian presidency this time was the whole idea that there is a lot of power in digital public infrastructures to set off exponential effects. And we should continue to explore that pathway and see, for example, in financial inclusion, if India could achieve in 8 years what would have taken 47 years to complete, those are the kind of responses that we need across climate, health, education, livelihoods, gender equity, across all the countries of the world. So we have to see how we can bring that into our recommendations to saying that is something that we should be leveraging, and specifically because we need everything on the table. We cannot do this by leaving anything around because there's just too much to do in too little time. So my submission is, how do we bring that thought process forward, refine it, help and build the capacity in the countries, like we heard from the team here from Africa saying, how do we build the capacity to do things like that, to think like that? And I think given that we are talking to the think tanks, it's important that we bring that idea of exponentiality and the idea of what tools do we have to create that exponentiality. Does capital create exponential effect is a good question. Does capacity building create exponential effect? Good question. Can we use digital to create exponential effects? Good question. Can we use policy and regulations to create exponential effects? Good question. So I think those questions are the ones that we should obsess with, and that's my recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hirat, Saviti, a few words of pre-conclusion.
Thank you. So I think one of the biggest things that came out of the Indian G20 presidency is something called the high-level principles for lifestyles for sustainable development, or the Varanasi principles. What they basically make clear is that there is, what they've achieved is consensus around the understanding that we cannot address the SDGs or the poly crisis that we're trying to work our way out of without dealing with the root causes that are causing all of this, right? And the root cause is the economic paradigm that is the dominant one the world over. And what they suggest is a set of principles that need to underpin a new paradigm, a life economy that does not separate between various development and environmental and economic goals, all the way from national policy down to individual choice and action. So I think that's a huge step forward. And there's a commitment by governments to act on those principles to bring them into reality. And what that requires is policy solutions that address the fundamental systemic challenges we have. You have to build the intellectual architecture, infrastructure for a whole new economic paradigm. We're not starting from nothing. There's decades of effort that's gone into this. But now we've got the G20 demanding it. The governments want this. I think there's an opportunity, and there's going to be a summit convened by India before their presidency ends on the life economy, a global G20 summit in Delhi in sometime in October, November. And it's an opportunity to bring together think tanks, academia, philanthropy, development actors, governments, doers, the practitioners of the new paradigm, to think together what kind of a roadmap we could undertake through the Brazilian and the South African presidencies to actually manifest this paradigm. So the summit is very action-oriented. The idea is that commitments to action will be formulated ahead of time and launched at the summit, or formulated at the summit and launched. One of those commitments that's been in formation with RIS, the OECD, and other actors, a number of folks who are in this call, UNRIST, UNDP, and others have been in discussion about this, is to mobilize a global network of think tanks that can do a sprint, a 6, 7, 8 month sprint, to basically analyze this new economic paradigm, the life economy across the T20 or the G20 and other countries, and come back to the Brazilian presidency with evidence-based intelligence on what it looks like, what the barriers are, what the enablers are, and what kind of policy interventions can start to move that agenda forward. This has come together. This is going to come together as some kind of an alliance, a global alliance for life economy, research, and innovation is the current name, Gallery. Everyone's invited to join, and this is a conversation I'm sure many of us will continue to have going forward.
Thank you.
Irad, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you also for the colleagues who have been following online from the African Union NEPAD. Ali Hollowell, special thanks also because you have been a driving force in sort of mobilizing the impact investment community. I know that. Thank you very much. And the final word, so for today's discussion to Deepali. Deepali, the floor is yours.
Very difficult to wrap up all the wonderful suggestions, recommendations, and a lot of food for thought, honestly. I think we really need to reflect and really see how we can be, the time to act is now. How can we act efficiently, effectively, so that, you know, our voices are heard, so we can really drive change, because marginalized communities are really facing the brunt of everything that we've discussed today. So there's and I can feel there's a real sense of urgency around this table. So thank you so much. And I really, this is just not the start, but we've been having conversations. We want to build further on these conversations, but also at the end of the day, I think the challenge or the opportunity, let's call it an opportunity, is where can we all kind of sing from the same hymn book? Like, are there a couple of core issues, no matter where we based, but you know, this is something at a global level we're going to be pursuing, but then also making sure in our own areas of work, how we kind of taking that back, bringing stuff at a global level is going to be important. And of course, from a Rockefeller Foundation perspective, we're on this journey together. And if there's anything we can do, we stand ready to see how we can be playing an effective role, because we genuinely believe in the power of collaboration and alliances and networks. That's been part of our DNA. And also, I think as we're leaving this conversation, an important aspect to think about is who's not at this table, who should be here at this table. And all of you have such phenomenal networks. So how do we really make sure that we are representing everybody who needs to be part of this conversation? And at the same time, how do we take this back to the constituencies that really need to be hearing what we're doing? So thank you so much. I'm taking back a lot of excellent inputs and a lot to reflect on. So I'll turn to Nicholas and Kaori to really see how we can kind of move forward. So thank you. And again, Ambassador Chinoy, you've just been such a wonderful inspiration throughout the last year with the G20, and otherwise also, you know, anytime I have a problem, he's somebody I turn to. And likewise, Dean Sonobe and your team has just been phenomenal. So on behalf of the Rockefeller Foundation, thank you to both of you. And of course, for all of you for coming here. So let the conversation go on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Secretary Rodrigo Wallenberg, for joining us. And thank you, and special applause for Natalia, who has saved us. Thank you very much, and for all the team who is somewhere and everywhere in the former Rockefeller Foundation, because this was a, yes, you will have to thank many people, and Marina and Hirad. Yeah, virtual participants have been thankful. So thank you very much, and please enjoy the refreshments outside, and we keep in touch very soon. Thank you.